It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we welcome back to the show one of the game's great players. He has almost 16 million in live tournament winnings. He is a nosebleed high-stakes circuit regular. He is a run-at-once coach. He is Canada's finest. He is Daniel Dvoress. Daniel, welcome back.
Glad to be back. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so you've brought us a very cool hand, objectively. It comes from the Super High Roller Bowl Bahamas 250k event in November 2019, which you won, of course. It's the start of the final table. The blinds are 15k, 30k with a 30k big blind ante. Daniel, you open to 60k under the gun 8-handed with the Queen 10 of diamonds. You're playing 1.825 million, approximately 61 big blinds. You are 5 of 8. Jason Koon flats under the gun 1. He's playing 2.81 million, approximately 70 big blinds. He's 2 of 8. Action folds around. Okay, Dara, I'm actually going to start with you on this one. Final table ICM is something you literally wrote the book on quite recently. The stacks at this final table are as follows. Daniel has 1.825 million. Jason has 2.81 million. Seth Davies is the chip leader right behind them with 2.9 million. Justin Bonomo has 1.4. Steve O'Dwyer has 1.9. Kathy Lane has 2.1. Y Long Chan is in the small blind with 1.4. And Eric Seidel is in the big blind. He's the short stack with 900k. So nobody is really that short at all. Eric has 30 big blinds, but everyone else is ranging from 47 to 73 bigs. It's less likely, therefore, that players will simply get it in pre-flop. That doesn't mean, though, that stacks aren't in jeopardy. It just means post-flop ICM will play a major factor at this final table. Given the chip stack distribution here, how cautiously does Daniel need to proceed versus Jason?
I mean, the short answer is way more cautiously than if this wasn't the final table. And particularly since this is the start of the final table, and that's when ICM is at its most extreme. This is something that a lot of people get back to front. They think that as you get nearer and nearer to the win, ICM ratchets up, but it's actually at its most extreme at the start. ICM affects things a number of ways. Pre-flop, as you mentioned, you do kind of have to play more cautiously, and people are not going to just, shove 30 big blinds in with pocket twos. But when you're not getting it in pre-flop, it does move to post-flop, as you say. And a number of things typically happens. The player with the most ICM pressure ends up having to play more passively, and sizings in general tend to go down. I mean, the guys are so deep here that a lot of the time they're not going to be all in by the river, unless a lot of bets go in on an earlier street or big bets. But that tends not to happen with ICM anyway. Sizings go down. But if the all-in does come at some point, the same premium that you needed pre-flop to call an all-in still applies. And that's something which sometimes I think people kind of lose sight of as well. They understand that they need a much stronger hand than normal to call an all-in pre-flop. But the same is true post-flop.
Well, thank you for that. That's very helpful going forward. Daniel, I have 2 questions for you. Firstly, I think a lot of players might bin the Queen 10 suited under the gun. Why is it important to keep battling with these sorts of holdings?
So I am in a little bit of an awkward position in that I'm middle stacked, but everyone else, including Jason here, also has to play a somewhat tighter range. And I don't want to be in a situation where I'm just opening something like 8 or 9% under the gun, which is, I think, what I would be opening if I were to start folding suited broadways. So I am going to be opening a tighter range, but under ICM pressure, I prefer to use high cards to open anyway. So even if I'm opening, let's say, a really tight 12% range, I'm still going to keep opening the suited broadways and maybe start folding some of the pocket pairs that without ICM, I would potentially consider opening instead.
Okay. And secondly, expanding a little bit on what Dara said a moment ago, it's nigh on impossible to calculate exactly in these spots, but you can set yourself up with useful ICM pillars of knowledge, if you will, good guideposts to help you navigate in game. When you looked at this situation going to the flop, and obviously in this spot, Jason has called you in position, what are you generally thinking?
So the first thing I'll think about to set a baseline is how I would play this spot if it were for chips, but using the ranges that I have kind of adjusted to reflect that I'm opening a little bit tighter. Jason's probably flatting a little bit tighter. At the same time, Jason might have some stronger flats as well, which would be 3-betting a little bit more aggressively if we were just playing for chips. But the thing that I do here is first I set a baseline of how I would play for chips. And then usually you just play some version of that, but more passive under ICM pressure.
Well, to the flop, the pot is 195k and it comes ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, eight of diamonds. A combo draw for you on a decent board for you, but also a board that hits Jason's tighter and more condensed range. There's plenty of ICM considerations here which motivate you to keep it small ball. You check and Jason bets 150k, almost 3/4 pot. You call. Daniel, your decision to check call a big draw demonstrates in one sense your desire to proceed cautiously, but it's also just a good way to play a draw this big, I guess. Jason's chunky enough bet does show strength and it does indicate a plan to perhaps leverage your stack by the river. Can you talk me through your thought process on this street?
So there's a couple of things going on that went into me wanting to check call. The first thing is just a global sort of idea that I want to be pretty passive on this board, both initially with checking range and also replying to the bet. So I don't think that I should be check raising here very often, if at all. That's kind of the general idea. Like, I just don't want to be playing big pots here. And then the other idea here is more specific to the board and the hand that I have. I do have a huge combo draw, but it's quite a discrete draw in that if you think about what Jason's potentially going to be value betting for multiple streets, if I hit a straight, two pair sets, they're going to keep value betting. So it's not like if I hit a straight, suddenly that's like an action killer and no money is going to go into the pot. Same goes for the flush to a lesser extent, but because of how tight my opening range is with the ace of diamonds on the board, if the flush gets there, Jason's usually going to put at least one more street of bets in anyway. So there's not this huge incentive for me to put money in myself with this draw right away, because I can actually see if I hit it and then money is still going to go into the pot regardless.
That makes a lot of sense. Dara, have you anything to add to that?
One of the things with ICM is obviously, as we said, you just need more equity to get all in. Now, oftentimes when you're playing just for chips, when you have a really, really strong draw, you're happy to just check raise and get it all in, knowing that if you get called, you have 50 to 60% equity, say, depending on your draw. So two good things can happen. You can fold at some point and you win the hand right now with your queen high, or you get it in actually as a slight favorite. But in ICM world, that second thing, getting in as a slight favorite, isn't actually good anymore. So that sort of forces you to play more passively, as Daniel said. And the other thing is, like, we have other parts of our range that have to play passively as well. So we have to protect a fairly passive range going forward. When we were looking at sims for the post-flop section of the ICM book, one thing we saw time and time again, we ended up calling it downward drift, which was basically when you're under ICM pressure, you take a less aggressive action than you would normally. If you would normally bet big, maybe you bet small a lot of the time. If your strategy just for chips would be to bet small, suddenly a lot of those hands become checks because of ICM. Similarly, if you're the player out of position, your check raises can become check calls. And I think that's kind of what's going on here.
Very good. Well, to the turn, there's 495k in the pot, and it comes to three of clubs. So the board now reads ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, eight of diamonds, three of clubs, two flush draws out there. Again, you check, and again, Jason goes fairly big, 400k for roughly 80% pot. You use a time extension before making the call. By calling here, you make the pot roughly 1.3 million with an effective 1.2 million behind. So that's roughly 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio. Daniel, I think this is where some people might have executed the big semi-bluff, confident that they have 20 to 30% if called. I got to say, I'd be a bit worried myself, given Jason's large sizings on a board that could easily have hit your hand too. Why would shoving now be a catastrophic mistake?
So I was 5 of 8 coming into this table, but I think the stacks between third place and sixth place were all very close. So for chips, check shoving, getting a fold, obviously great. Check shoving, getting called, having pretty good equity, it's fine, especially with the dead money in the pot. It's kind of like, well, we got it in. We still have a lot of outs and there's a lot of dead money. Sweet. But getting it in here with 20 to 30% equity would just be a disaster. We would be playing something like a 3.6 million chip pot. And by getting it in, I'm just essentially free rolling all of the other stacks a pay jump 70% of the time. So you could think of it as a bunch of my equity leaks to everyone else if I'm playing a check shove here. So I really want to avoid that. And again, the same specific concepts that I talked about on the flop still apply here. Like if I hit a 9, I would expect Jason to keep value betting a set. If I hit a king, I would expect Jason to keep value betting a set. If I hit a flush, things get a little bit more dicey, but I still think that my hand, it's discreet enough as far as some of its outs go, where I can check call and still have the implied odds and avoid the disaster of potentially getting it in.
Yeah, to go into a bit more detail on that, Dara, Daniel almost certainly does have clean outs. We know that Jack and 3 of diamonds wouldn't be good here, but they would be good some of the time. A better flush draw would have to be the King Jack or King 9 of diamonds. I'd be tempted to disregard the latter from Jason's flatting range and possibly discount the former 2. He might not flat King Jack of diamonds pre, and he could certainly proceed differently with it on flop and turn, given that it has a bit more equity in terms of that second pair, as well as the draw. His straight draw has to be good unless it comes a club. I would be a bit wary of that. I think maybe Jason could play a backdoor flush draw this way, particularly if it had some kind of combo stuff going on as well. Nonetheless, though, an estimate of 25% equity versus the range seems about right. Daniel needs about 32% to make the call without ICM. So I'm going to guess that goes up to about 36% with ICM. He does have some good implied odds, though, which he mentioned there, which can obviously compensate. Is this the case then that the ICM predicament that Daniel finds himself in is actually perversely a good thing in this spot vis-a-vis likelihood of getting Jason to bluff more often on rivers? Does it weirdly increase the implied odds factor because Jason has to proceed more aggressively?
I mean, if Jason is going to proceed more aggressively, then sure. But going back to your calculation of like 32% without ICM, 35 to 36% with ICM, it's probably not that high because like not all the chips have gone in yet. It's important to realize that like even when you're playing in ICM extreme situations, putting half your stack in or even 3/4 of your stack in is a lot different from putting the last chips in. When you put the last chips in, yes, you need that big premium in equity on that last bit, but you don't need that much more on the earlier bets. But there is a general principle which you're kind of getting to here that when you are proceeding, like there are different types of hands that have 25% equity. There's a hand which is good 25% of the time, but it's never going to improve. And then if we get to the river and he shoves, now our 25% isn't enough anymore because we do need that extra premium because it's the final bet for all of our chips. You have hands like this, which are draws to very, very strong hands, and they're much better hands to proceed with in these cases. When you look at ICM sims, you see a lot of situations where the solver will actually give up with fairly strong, in inverted commas, made hands in earlier streets, like, you know, king, queen on a king high board, but it will continue maybe with bottom pair and nut backdoors for that very reason. If we're only likely to get all in on the river, it's important that we arrive on the river with hands that are nutty enough to be able to call a shove and not get there with hands which are never strong enough to call a shove.
That's a great point, and also a great pickup on my exaggeration of the ICM implications on that amount. I think that's a great note for people to bear in mind. To the river, the pot is 1.295 million now. The river comes the 5 of diamonds, making you a flush, Daniel, on a final board of ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 5 of diamonds. If he does have the less likely king high flush draw now, well, GG, I guess coolers do happen. You check and he checks back. You table your queen high flush and scoop up a very nice pot. Before we reveal Jason's holding, some people might be asking the question, why didn't you lead the river? So Daniel, why didn't you?
So while it's appealing to lead the river in that, you know, obviously I hit my flush and I have a strong hand, I don't think that it's what my range wants to do all that often, because generally at the river, most of my range will be condensed, kind of bluff catchery, and Jason's range is going to be polarized. Now that does shift a little bit because if he has something like 2 pair or a set, and now I've made my flush, obviously that part of the range is not polarized against some other parts of my range. But generally speaking, this is me having a condensed range, him having a polar range. So it doesn't make much sense to shove into a polar range.
Well, Dara, it was later revealed that Jason actually checked back a set of 8s, a super strong hand, but one that does, of course, get nudged down the pecking order by that river card. Replaying the hand from Jason's point of view, he called pre-deepish with a medium pair. Seems fine. He bet 75% with bottom set on the flop. Probably quite a smart bet, given that Daniel is going to proceed passively, even with his like big ace-x hands, and would have to be calling a couple of streets probably with those. He bet 80% with third set on a turn that brought 2 flush draws. That just seems like a pretty good sizing on that board. And again, he does have a really strong hand, and he is still targeting that same approximate range of Daniel's. Then on the front door flush card on the river, he checks back, losing only to aces, jacks and flushes. It seems on the face of it too nitty, but was it?
I'd be very surprised if it is too nitty. Like, if you think about all we've been saying about how strong a hand you need to call in all in, that means that if he does shove, Daniel's going to have to fold a lot of hands that would be slam down calls if they were just for chips. But they're not. So now the question becomes, like, does he even have enough hands anymore that are called that we're beating when we shove our set? And I suspect the answer is not. I didn't run this spot myself, but the very fact that Daniel needs that much of a stronger hand to call sort of makes this less of a value shove. And yeah, I personally don't think it's too nitty.
Well, Daniel, you did put this one through a solver. What did it tell you?
So it told me that Jason's pretty brilliant. And indeed, it would be a little bit too light to bet with his hand. I think it's important to remember that ranges are super narrow here. And not only does he lose to a flush, but he also does lose to ace, ace, and jack, jack. You also have to consider that I'm going to be very passive on flop and on turn. So I still have jacks. I don't want to say that I'll never check raise jacks at some point before in the hand, but I do have jacks most of the time. Aces, I'll play almost always like this as well. So you could look at it like he loses to aces, he loses to jacks, jack X of diamonds, stuff like king, queen of diamonds, queen 10 of diamonds. He loses to quite a few combos. So then you have to ask, well, is he getting called by enough hands that he actually beats? And I think that after so much money has gone in, the answer is actually no. So as frustrating as it was to see him check back, he just made a really good play.
Well, the first thing I love about that is I have this image in my head now that when you input this into a solver, the solver just comes up with a big chyron saying, Jason is brilliant. That's the first thing that strikes me. But I suppose the thing that I came back to then was like, as the hand is played out, is he supposed to shove his entire range whenever he bets? Like, could he consider a smaller bet?
I think he could have. So I think parts of his range could bet smaller. Generally, in ICM heavy spots, we avoid getting all in. Now here he has me covered, so it's a little bit different, but sizes do go down a little bit. But I actually don't think that even putting in a smaller bet with his hand is all that great, because his hand is just a lot weaker than it appears.
In a way, he'd be better off having ace jack, wouldn't he, to go for a thin value bet than eights?
I think so. I mean, he will lose to eights, but he does block me from having aces and jacks, obviously. But he also, at the same time, blocks some of the hands that he wants to get called by. It would be nice if he had something like ace jack with the jack of diamonds, but I don't think that ace jack offsuit is part of his pre-flop calling range.
Well, a fascinating hand on a pretty big stage too. Jason Koon, clearly a master when it comes to understanding how to get himself out of trouble as well. Daniel, you went on to win this for over $4 million, your largest score to date. Like, not asking a woman her age, I'm far too polite to ask you how much of yourself you had, but I do hope it was a very nice piece. Thank you very much for your thoughts on this one, Dara O'Carney.
Thanks, David.
And thank you very much for bringing us such a tasty hand, Daniel Dvoress.
No worries at all. I was very glad to do another one of these.
Thanks, Daniel.